Welcome to Across the Balkans. Great to have you with us on the show. I'm Ludovica Brignola. The European Union needs to enlarge if it means to stay strong and safe. This is what European Council President Charles Michel said at the Bled Strategic Forum in Slovenia last week. Speaking on the impact the war in Ukraine has had on Europe, Michel added it's now time for countries that have been waiting for EU membership for almost 20 years to be given a clear goal. The Council chief also said the bloc must be ready to accept new member states by 2030. He called on all aspirants to implement judicial reforms, continue the fight against organised crime and corruption, and align their economies with EU member states.
This is, I know, ambitious, but it is necessary. It shows that we are serious. It will build momentum. It will give a transformative boost to reforms, and it will generate interest, investment, and better understanding. It will also encourage all of us to work better together. The window of opportunity is open. We need to act on it, and that's why EU leaders will discuss enlargement at our next European Council meetings. We will take a stand on the opening of negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, and I also expect Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia to be back on the table.
The 6 Western Balkan states vying to join the bloc are at different stages. North Macedonia became the first country to be granted EU candidate status in 2005, but following several failed attempts, its accession negotiations formally opened just last year. Montenegro followed by receiving candidate status in 2010. And despite its accession negotiations opening after just 2 years, the country's integration process has been stalled due to political instability. Serbia, the country whose EU integration remains linked to its normalization with Kosovo, was granted candidate status in 2012. Both countries have held high-level meetings facilitated by the EU to reach a legally binding agreement. Albania obtained its candidate status in 2014, and its negotiations began last year along with North Macedonia. Bosnia and Herzegovina is the latest country in the region to be granted candidate status. Bosnia received its candidacy last December alongside Moldova and Ukraine in the wake of Russia's war. And Kosovo remains the only country in Western Balkans that hasn't obtained candidate status. The country officially applied for EU membership after the war in Ukraine began last year. Joining me now from Brussels is Toby Vogel. He is a political analyst specializing in the EU and the Balkans. He's also the co-founder of Democratization Policy Council. Thank you very much for joining us today. Right, an ambitious time frame that Charles Michel's alluded to, not unattainable though. I mean, is this just wishful thinking on the part of Michel, or is this really a new political momentum we are witnessing?
I think there is new political momentum, primarily because of the war in Ukraine and the European Union's response to that, which has been to grant candidate status to Ukraine. And that, of course, has sort of revived, has pushed up really the issue of EU enlargement to the top or near the top of the European Union's agenda. Whether this particular call to be ready for both for the EU and the candidate countries to be ready by 2030, whether that will provide momentum, I think I would doubt that, because history has shown that dates have a tendency to sort of assume a life of their own and become self-fulfilling almost in the sense that they will lock in people, will feel them responsible to actually meet those goals and take shortcuts to meet them.
Interesting. Obviously, this begs the question, why is Michel urging the bloc now? Because he said it's time to give countries a clear goal after they've waited for 20 years. I mean, is that why he is saying this now? Or as you've alluded to, I mean, the Ukraine war is really having a big impact on all this?
I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, there is a general sense that the EU's enlargement policy has drifted. As you said, 20 years ago in Thessaloniki, the countries of the Western Balkans were basically given a membership prospect. 20 years on, the only country to have joined in the meantime from that region is Croatia. And that was 10 years ago. So there's a general feeling that the policy is on autopilot and not delivering, that it has failed to create momentum for reform in the Western Balkans. At the same time, also on the EU side, there hasn't been any reform of decision-making procedures. There hasn't been any serious thought given to the sort of strategic implications of enlargement, and so on and so forth. So clearly, both sides have to do their homework. And I'm reading Michel's call really as a bit of a wake-up call.
Interesting you say that policy seems to be an autopilot now. Corruption seems one of the biggest factors, if not the biggest factor, essentially stalling Western Balkan countries' accession to the EU. What do you make of that, and how can it be solved across the region?
I would not necessarily call it corruption. I think I would describe this as state capture. So, the capture of state institutions by incumbent elites, political and business elites. That is a huge problem right across the region in different ways, not in each country to the same extent. But it is very hard to see how to address this other than through deep structural reform and a change in the incentive structure for people in government and for the incumbent elites.
I'd also like to ask you something. How important would it be to have Western Balkan countries included in the bloc? What would their role be, politically speaking, but also economically speaking?
Well, these are small countries in the overall scheme of things. These are small countries with weak economies, essentially. So this would be clearly a burden for the European Union. But frankly, also a burden that's completely manageable. Romania alone is larger, considerably larger than the entire Western Balkans. So, when people talk about absorption capacity on the EU side, I think that is a fair point to make about the countries such as Ukraine. But it is not really an issue with the Western Balkans. One very specific issue would obviously be the EU's internal decision-making processes, where the requirement for consensus or unanimity among all the member states essentially gives each member state a veto over core policies of the Union. That would be more problematic if you had 5 or 6 new members.
Right, that's an interesting point. A question on North Macedonia and Albania, because North Macedonia became the first country to be granted EU candidate status in 2005, but its accession negotiations were formally opened just last year, following several failed attempts in 17 years. As recently as October 2019, France was supported also by the Netherlands, and Denmark vetoed opening negotiations talks for North Macedonia and Albania. What's happening on this front, in your opinion?
Well, what's been happening really is that current EU member states have a tendency to use the accession process to deal with bilateral issues. In the case of North Macedonia, that was first Greece, now it is Bulgaria, that have made demands concerning North Macedonia's name, its constitution, the people that the constitution refers to, minority rights, and so on and so forth. Behind that are hiding other member states, and you mentioned a few of them, that are generally speaking very skeptical about EU enlargement. They don't necessarily agree with the strategic imperative for enlargement, and they don't particularly want these specific countries to join anytime soon. And I'm afraid that's a club that's quite large inside the European Union. And I don't necessarily see a national leader in the current member states who would make a strong case why enlargement is necessary and is in the Union's own interest.
Do you agree with what Charles Michel said, though, about the bloc being safer if it were to include those countries as well? Or do you understand France's point as well, for instance?
I do in principle, although one could have a long philosophical debate about this. But one point I would like to make is that the European Union is deeply invested in the security and the stability of the Western Balkans. It has a peacekeeping mission, a peace implementation mission in Bosnia, which has for over a decade now been vastly below operational strength. So the European Union has not necessarily always taken its own promises to secure stability in the Western Balkans very seriously. And that is, I think, an indication of how peripheral really the Western Balkans are to most member states.
Right, a thorny issue then, Serbia, the country whose EU integration remains linked to its normalization with Kosovo, right? It became a candidate in 2012. Both countries have been holding high-level meetings. They were facilitated by the EU to reach a legally binding agreement. And now Serbia finds itself in a very difficult position, having to manage strong ties with Russia, but also leaning towards the EU. What's happening on that front?
Well, those are exactly the two main issues that have been holding up Serbia's, progress really on the path towards the EU, and these are political issues. So it's alignment with Russia, it's foreign policy alignment with Russia, and it's drifting away from alignment with the European Union, as well as the issue of normalization of relations with Kosovo. Are political issues. These are not, technocratic issues that require, changes in legislation and that sort of thing, which is what makes up the bulk of the EU integration process. These are highly political issues, and I don't really see any obvious path to a resolution with the current leadership.
Right, and on Kosovo, the country remains the only country in Western Balkans essentially that hasn't obtained a candidate status. It officially applied for EU membership after the war in Ukraine started last year. Are you optimistic on Kosovo's front? What are the main problems still hampering all this?
I am not optimistic on Kosovo. I'm not optimistic on the region generally, but I'm especially pessimistic on Kosovo for a simple reason that 5 EU member states have not recognized Kosovo as an independent country.
Right.
And they have done so mostly for entirely for domestic reasons, so internal politics. Now, in some of those cases, I can see potential movement. I'm thinking of Greece, for example, which has a very cordial relationship with Pristina, stopping short of recognition. But with others, I'm thinking in particular of Cyprus. This is an issue of national importance, of strategic importance, of even identity. So I don't see an easy pathway to recognition by these 5 non-recognizers. And of course, that's only the first hurdle. That would only remove a very important hurdle, but only one of them. After that, you have the entire issue of relations with Serbia, and you have the issue of, the generic issues that really affect all the countries in the region, rule of law, and so on.
Toby Vogel, thank you very much. Very interesting analysis. Thank you for being with us today. Much appreciated.